Yo, how are you doing, folks? Welcome to episode 113 of the Simpa Life Podcast. Still with the camera that's auto-focusing and not showing my face for some reason. It's blurring me out. Honestly, I'm not this white. I have been out in the sun today. You can see there's a slight bit of color. Hope you're keeping well, folks. It has been a good few weeks. I decided to take a little bit of a mental health break. Not sure if I'm all the way ready to get back, but you know what? There's so many wonderful people in the world that I want to have these conversations with. So I've decided to throw myself back into the hot seat. And yeah, we'll pretend like we're 100% because this conversation is going to be 100% awesome and interesting. We've already been preambling there for about 25 minutes. I've made a few notes of some of the topics me and our guest have already discussed. Nearly gave away the game there, even though obviously you can see on the other side. And when you've clicked on the preview, you're quite aware of who today's guest is. But with that, we'll segue on to reveal that today's guest is an American cannabis advocate, activist, and author. They're one of the co-founders of the legendary High Times magazine, where his 20-year column Ask Ed earned him the title of the Ganja Guru. Welcome today's guest, Ed Rosenthal.
Hi.
How you doing, Ed?
Hi.
Good to have you on, man. Good to have you on. Obviously, we've just sort of been preambling there about several different topics, a few of which, like I said, I've made a note for us to come back to. Nice cat, like a panther. Nice. Yeah, my cat's locked out of this room because obviously I smoke my 2 blunts while we record these things, and he would be far too high in this tiny little hotbox space of mine. But yeah, let's move on then to, I suppose, first question for people that will want to, so we'll get this out of the way of how and when did you sort of first get involved in cannabis? Obviously, you've been in the space for several decades now, but how did it all begin?
Well, in college in the 60s, and when I met cannabis, I knew that we would be having a long-term relationship. And in fact, it's a female that I've had the longest-term relationship with.
Nice. What I often hear from people that have been in the game, as it were, a long time, it's the same sort of interaction that I had. As soon as I experienced cannabis, it was just like, oh, this thing's going to be important. This is something to protect and care about and learn more about. And I mean, I'm still very much in my infancy on my journey, having seen obviously people like yourself and how long you've been at the game and how prolific you are. I mean, you've been writing and producing books for many decades. So can you tell us, like, how did you first get involved in writing? Was it something you were doing at college, or was it something you kind of maneuvered into?
You know, from the time I was in elementary school, even though I wasn't considered a good writer, I knew that I was going to earn that would be part of my life, and I was very interested in science and especially plant science from the time I was young, and it evolved into an interest in cannabis. So
Nice.
so it was very natural for me to start growing it.
Did you start growing so right away, like in college in the 60s? I mean, that was
As soon as I returned home, and my parents had moved out of the apartment that we had been living in, so I gathered a group of roommates, and one it was a large apartment, and one of the bedrooms was devoted to cannabis.
nice. So was this in the 60s?
Yeah, in the 60s, in the 60s and very early 70s, and that was in the Bronx in New York City.
Nice. So what was sort of the equipment like back then in terms of like
So,
carbon filter, etc.?
nothing like that, but we had fluorescent lights and fertilizers, soil.
Mm. Mine, I can't think what it's. I've been so
And
spoiled.
then there were these fluorescent lights that were brighter. They used more electricity, and they put out more light, 2.5 times the light, so you could get a pretty bright light with the fluorescence.
So,
They were called VHO, very high output fluorescents. So they put out a typical fluorescent is 8-foot fluorescent was 80 watts, and these were 250 watts. So if you had a bank of those, you'd have a very bright light, and you could grow good cannabis.
Nice. Yeah, what I was wondering there was sort of like, did you have to sort of upscale, or I suppose 250 is kind of you don't need the power packs, can't you, what they call them, the
Ballasts.
ballasts. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, they took a special ballast.
Mm.
It was, how when you buy a fluorescent unit, you might get a unit that has everything in it.
Mm-hmm.
That it comes complete. You just plug it in. That was sort of like that.
Oh, cool. Yeah, man. Again, my generation being highly spoiled with hydro shops, being able to literally go and buy cannabis specific
Yeah.
nutrients, soils, lighting equipment.
Well, that came by the 80s. By the late 70s, that was happening.
Mm.
And then people switched to VHOs, very high out. HPSs, and so that was when they were growing indoors, and a lot of cannabis continues to be grown outdoors.
Mm.
If you have the right weather and the right climate, it's pretty easy to do. Not most of Britain is somewhat overcast, but there are some bright spots that are pretty sunny. And anywhere where you see greenhouses that are growing tomatoes, you could do the same thing with cannabis. So there are a whole section of agricultural Britain.
Mm. Yeah, very true. As many of my friends with greenhouses out there can attest, you can get some pretty big and pretty potent plants if you time it right. Obviously, with our quite short spring and summer, as it were, our lighting is a bit funny in this country. It's probably as bad as my camera light right now. It's irritating.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's made it easier to grow outdoors are the plants that flower, that they have their own schedule of flowering, so that they're not light dependent. So that makes it very easy.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of breeding. I know there's we'll shout out Kyle Esplin, former guest. He runs the Scottish Hemp Association. I think they've got 11 farms up there now using Finola variants, which I believe is a Finnish cultivar. And again, yeah, obviously what they're doing with the day neutral gene from autoflowers, with the breeding projects these days, it's pretty second to none. Like I've seen a lot of impressive autoflowers as well in terms of bud structure, and they're starting to lose that ruderalis kind of like flavor to them as well, which is nice to see.
There's a lot of sophisticated autoflowers around now.
Yeah,
both CBD and THC.
CBG is as well. So I've seen some other people trying to work on amplification of other minor cannabinoids, and obviously it's going to take a while for these breeding projects to to catch up to kind of the levels that we're used to seeing with other more prolific cannabinoids. But again, it's very exciting, the amount of science and just creativity and curiosity that is still around the cultivation of cannabis. Obviously, there's a lot going on in laboratories and synthesizing, and we'll get onto that later. But just it's wonderful to see that people still have the passion for the plant, for actually seeing the little seed turn into these wonderful trees.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you as well, High Times. So obviously you are one of the co-founders. You were obviously there for quite a hell of a long time. What was it like? Obviously, you have Mark Emery, as I suppose, as a contemporary up in Canada, getting in such trouble for speaking of cannabis, allowing books and literature. What were the early days like of High Times, and when you were first sort of writing about cannabis? Did you get much sort of backlash? Were you sort of vilified for what you were saying and doing?
Well, High Times was published in New York City, so there wasn't any government interference with it. we never had any kind of government interference. I had never had any direct government interference in any of my writing. So,
Nice.
but I did not, High Times was based in New York City at the time, and I was based in Bay Area of California. So my main contact with them was a few phone calls and then sending them articles.
Mm. Okay.
So wasn't involved in a lot of the internal politics that seemed to, and tumultuous politics that happened inside the magazine. I just had to get my articles in.
Mm. Good place to be. Good place to be.
Well, one interesting thing that I learned later is, I would go to High Times and, when I was visiting New York, and I'd light up and, we'd smoke together and everything. And, or when I was there for an extended period, I'd have the use of an office and, I'd light up and everything. And it was only later that I learned, and nobody ever mentioned to me, that you weren't supposed to smoke there. Nobody ever mentioned it to me. People would come into the office when I was there, and they'd share a joint with me. They'd never say, we're not allowed to smoke here. So
Yeah.
as I said, I wasn't subject to the politics of High Times, New York.
Nice. That's a very strong sign of respect, I would say. Obviously, yeah.
I mean, if they had said to me, we're not allowed to smoke here, I would have said, oh, okay. I wouldn't have resisted it or anything, but nobody ever said it to me. It was only later that I learned that. So.
Wow, man! Again,
you see, I had a prescription from now deceased Dr. Todd Mikaria, who was a marijuana activist, and on the prescription it said, should never be without marijuana on the recommendation. So,
man.
I guess it.
I suppose, yeah, you're following doctor's advice. I think that's pretty fair. That's pretty fair. Makes me wonder if we can get this on prescriptions in the UK. I wonder if I could get my doctor and his advice part of the prescription to be like, yeah, Mr. Carter cannot be without cannabis. Interesting. It's one of those things that it still doesn't seem to have evolved yet, even in sort of legal regions, that I would assume more cannabis businesses would have more cannabis consuming staff, whereas there seems to be this thing of, oh no, not at work, where a lot of the creative people I know that have worked in cannabis, they work with cannabis, they are with cannabis and stoned all day, frankly, and they're still efficient, still operating within their systems. In fact, I would say it adds to the value of their output, doesn't detract from it. Yet a lot of the spaces that we see now that are supposed to represent cannabis culture, I'm not going to name anybody around the world of certain magazines or media outlets, but they've become very hollow, very capitalist, rather than, that's not to say that these two things are not mutually exclusive, the cannabis liberation and capitalism can't coexist.
Well, capitalism is capitalism, and profit first. There's a big discussion now whether in the United States, whether corporations' primary responsibility is just to the stockholders, or is it to society as well?
Mm-hmm.
The society, so that's exactly what you're discussing there. Is it primarily capitalist, or are we primarily human-centered?
Yeah, it's a really interesting sort of transmutation and changing of this structure of economics that we've lived under, because it's this stakeholder versus shareholder debate. And I think cannabis in some ways has pushed that, because a lot of the social equity that is tried to at least attempted to be codified into different states, legislations and models is an attempt to, I guess, hold capitalism to account for something that we were kind of discussing before we started recording, of where do the profits go? Who should profit from cannabis, and how should those systems sort of be established? And I think that's permeating out into wider capitalism. Obviously, you've got ESGs, environmental, corporate, social governance scores, which is a whole thing to go down. People just Google that and spend their day looking at that. It's something to learn about that I'm not going to bring up in this podcast, because honestly, this is all we'll talk about. But yeah, it's a lively debate, and I think it's one where we have an opportunity to really make meaningful change and to lead with the stoned foot forward, to coin a phrase, and have much more control and much more of a voice inside this industry, because the venture capitalists and the industrialists around us, they can't build this industry without us, without the growers, without the legacy community members, the people that understand how cannabis works, how the economics of it work. It's a unique commodity. It's like nothing else seen by humanity because of its multi-versatile nature. It's not just a drug or a building resource or a potential future battery solution. It's a biofuel. It's a plastic replacement. It's a multitude of things.
Well, Jack Hara and I had this friendly argument, and I said, well, you don't want a world that's dependent upon one species. So you have to have a multi-species environment. And I think attributing everything to cannabis and becoming dependent upon it as a sole source of any product, that becomes problematic. Especially, for instance, in the Isles there, you had the potato famine brought upon by a disease that affected, the crop, and the whole island all of Ireland had been dependent upon potatoes for its calories. And so when that crop failed, there was starvation. So I don't think that we should be dependent upon any one species. I think that what we need is a new way of looking at nature and how nature works, and at farming as well. And,
I think an agricultural revolution. I think I think of the Cavendish banana, and so in the 1800s, basically all bananas went extinct because of a very unique, not a viroid, some sort of virus. I can't recall off the top of my head. And basically, they had this one banana tree in a botanical garden somewhere in the world, and they just started cloning it. And now every banana that everybody eats is one of these bananas, unless it's obviously one of the most subtropical species and varieties. But the main one that everyone's used to is that bent yellow banana. And I think something similar is happening in cannabis now. We have hopslate and viroid, which is jumping over into cannabis and is starting to decimate grow spaces, and is the first sort of potential threat to cannabis. Sativa L is in all of its varieties, because it affects whatever you want to classify it as. Hemp over here, cannabis over there, medicinal over there. If it gets in your grow room, it's fatal. You know what I mean? There are issues. So I agree with that, and it's wonderful to hear anecdotally of yourself and Jack sort of having that conversation, because it's the same sort of friendly debates that I have with a lot of the activists nowadays, where, to kind of circle back to the point we were speaking of before we were recording about how do we make cannabis cheaper, my vision is to make all hemp cannabis. It's to every part of it, every plant that is grown is rewilded, is the drug type, so that we reduce the need to grow it in such.
But you know what?
Energy.
You know what? In the United States, where it's legal, even in the states where it's legal, people use a lot more CBD than they do cannabis. They may not inhale or ingest all the CBD, but a lot of it is used, especially as skin treatments and ointments and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want only the drug, only THC in there. You should take into account the other cannabinoids. But here's what I think about it is that of course, people will always use flower like you're doing now. But that more, if you think of all of the CBD that's being used and the way it's being used, and all of the THC and how it's being used, most of it is extraction or concentrate.
Mm-hmm.
So that a minority of the cannabis being used is used as flower. So if you're making concentrate or making extract, why not forego all of the bother of planting it and growing it and harvesting it, and instead transfer the genes to a yeast and brew it. And so, the ease of brewing is that in 5 days you have your product, and you don't have lights. You don't have that whole grow room and everything. And if you're going to make extractions, why not make them directly through yeast?
Yeah.
And most of our medicines now are made that way.
Mm-hmm.
Or a good many of our medicines, especially so a lot of the newer vaccines and other medicines are made by actually being expressed in yeast or bacteria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So think of it this way. You know how hard it is to set up a grow room. You grow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know how hard it is to set up a grow room. Now let's say I was setting up the new, quote, grow room. I take a 20-liter container or a 50-liter container or a 100-liter container, put some sugar in it, add water, and then put a package of yeast in it. And that yeast is specially bred or treated so that it will express THC. And other yeast that are in it will express different terpenes. So in the end, what you're going to do is refine those products from the beer.
Yeah, the biosynthesis obviously
and that's done in 5 days. You've waited 90 days now to harvest, right? If you with lights, this is 5 or 6 days away, no lights.
Yeah.
Put it in.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I get sort of the argument and the understanding, and obviously I'm not trying to create like a binary of it being sort of one or the other. The observations that sort of that I'm making and that I'm seeing from sort of the commentariats, I don't know what to call these individuals, people commenting on the current state of affairs, is the hemp bill in America has created an incredible amount of biomass that is being biosynthesized into a whole host of synthetic cannabinoids that we don't know what they do. Obviously, there's a big conversation still going on between obviously the entourage effect and whole plant versus isolate. There's obviously ways to patent processing for these things. So there's a former NBA player, he runs or is one of the faces of Peels, where they're doing this through modification from a compound they're getting off orange peel. There's quite a few like they're doing through yeast and different bacterial modifications. And I think for specific medications, yeah, probably quite a good way to go down that, as you say, for standardization, for safety, for being able to pass double and triple blind placebo-controlled trials, and for that kind of standardization. What I mean in sort of in the wilding and that being the basis of it, in terms of the biomass that's created is far larger in cannabis plants typically than hemp plants. The health of the plant and the flowers themselves, obviously, we know are beneficial to a multitude of different species, including bees and late season pollinators that we really dearly need to protect. The renutrification of grounds, the removal of toxins and heavy metals, etc. And then just having that mass material, that sequestered carbon in that material, which is probably sounding like Jack here, using that in all of the building materials and everything else. That it's one of the things I saw when I was at a farm in California, and I stood on a dry rack, a guy's balcony in a dry rack room, like a dry room and a cut room, and it pointed to this mountain, and it was sticks and stems. And he explained the licensing of saying, I grow cannabis, the drug, I'm not allowed to use the plant. And it just feels like it's missing the point that the plant itself can sequester the carbon that we're obviously all going to war with this current climate change paradigm that we're living under. And I feel that its uses in that way, it's not to replace those other things necessarily, but it's a way to work in conjunction with them, I think, and to decentralize a lot of what is happening. So we're seeing in some rural areas that are now starting to use cannabis as a direct building material. They don't need heavy machinery and these other things to build energy efficient homes. It's, I just feel there's a lot more to cannabis, the plant that needs to be, people need an opportunity to be free to explore. And I think that if we go too far down that scientific road without honoring the plant and kind of liberating the plant, in a few generations, there isn't going to be people like yourself and I that just dedicate their life to go and we want to talk about this plant and its history and what it does and everything around it. And I just worry that we kind of lose that. And I don't know, maybe that's me.
Well, the world today is much different than it was 30 years ago.
Mm.
And the rate of discovery is heating up. So I expect that in 30 years, the world will be significantly different than it is today. And environmentally as well, maybe not for the better. But that being the case, the way that humans act and the way humans interact and their relationship with nature are going to be different. So I see it actually, if we had that, let's say you liked a particular variety, let's say Romulan, that you happen to like the variety Romulan. What if you could just buy a pack of that yeast that we were talking about, and 5 days later you'd be harvesting your Romulan like THC and terpenes, and didn't have to go through the ritual of growing the plant, but instead, that the plant, people aren't really interested in cannabis. You may think that they are, but they're not. What all cannabis is, whether you realize it or not, or have thought of it this way, think of it in the same way as they talk about tobacco. Tobacco is a carrier for nicotine, and cannabis is a carrier for the cannabinoids and terpenes. And so if you could have the cannabinoids and terpenes without the plant, people wouldn't care. If they could go more direct, they wouldn't care. And that I think that, in a few years, a lot of people are going to be brewing their THC rather than growing it. And it will be a new ritual. You know, you think about what you and your friends do for a living. And probably 30 years ago, most of those jobs didn't exist, or many of them didn't exist.
Mm.
And you know what? I was in a restaurant the other day, and I was served water and a menu by a robot.
Fuck. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, listen, unlike a human, it didn't spill the water, and it was very polite.
It's I struggle with I so desperately want the Star Trek future of my youth. I so desperately want us to become so abundant with resource that there isn't the war for scarcity, that there isn't and I get obviously the advancements of things like this obviously can, but I think that I don't mind that being the future as long as it comes with my liberty and others to grow the plant if they wish, to cultivate that relationship, because it's made me a nicer person. Growing cannabis has changed my outlook on life. It's made me appreciate nature. It brought me in touch with myself. My house is now full of house plants. I love to tend and garden because of the relationship that I developed with the plant. And I get obviously in a few generations there'll be people that won't have that kind of introduction and relationship. Yeah.
Well, things change. As I said, think of all the work that your friends do for a living, and most of those jobs did not exist when they were, 30 years ago.
Well, we separate their jobs and what they do for a living, because what they do for a living has been around since time. I think a lot of the people I am friends with are people in obviously the community, in the culture, so they are vendors and people that trade and operate in the space.
Anybody who sits behind a computer, that job did not exist 30 years ago. How about that?
Trying to think how far we know in the future. That's probably about no way. Yeah. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Obviously, technology accelerates and changes the way that humans live and our society is constructed. I just hope that we're not still having this conversation of whether people should be locked in cages for the plant when that technology overtakes the plant, as it were. And I see this horrible crossover where there is a generation that never knows freedom, that they don't ever get their wants or needs met, and it's just the generations that come after that it's the same. Like a lot of the youth now, so the teenagers, early 20s, their first introduction with cannabis is often a vape cart. My first introduction was what we call tack, or like council estate hash, so really poorly repressed hash with bits of plastic and crap and all sorts in, and it was a horrible experience, but it was what you got access to. And so I get that that's again evolving with the generations, and that there'll be then same way with kids now that are consuming nicotine that have never smoked tobacco. They're just vaping nicotine.
Well, I I did certain biblical studies, not in a religious sense, but in more as an introduction to comparative religion. And the thing that I learned about from the Bible was, the Bible starts with the Bronze Age people who are semi-nomadic, and it ends with people in the Iron Age. And so that was a tremendous advantage, tremendous change in technology over that period of time, where once where there was so much more technology in the 1,000 or 1,500 years that the Bible covers. So anyway, what I learned from that, my big takeaway from that, is that technology changes, but human nature remains the same.
Mm.
That was my takeaway. So don't the structure of society may change, but the basic the basic things that drive humans, our genetic motivation, if you will, that will remain.
Yeah.
And that will shape our personalities and help to shape our societies. And it's nurture and nature. So society will evolve, but the basic human drive will evolve as quickly. That's my theory of it.
No, I think you're very correct. I often quip to people that I feel that our technology is Jetsons, but our mentality is Flintstones. And we can't kind of help that. It's not to diss anybody or everybody in that sentence, but we're still very primal, still very archaic. And
I think that I've been toying with this theory. We're way beyond cannabis right now, but I was toying with this theory that one of the most dangerous things that a woman can do, you know what that is? Childbirth. And in New York City, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, 120 years ago, the average woman in New York City lived to the age of 35. And the reason for the young death age was childbirth. Still very dangerous as compared with, let's say, skiing. Okay, so forever there was a shortage of women because it was always very dangerous, so a lot of women died in childbirth, and so there was a shortage of women and there was an excess of men. So there were two motivating forces. One was eliminate the excess of men. How do you do that?
War.
What?
War.
Right. And what's scarce in nature? Women, right? Capture the women, kill the men. Yeah. So maybe that in itself, even though women suffer much less, even though it's less dangerous even though childbirth is less dangerous, that just genetic propensity for that there might be just a genetic propensity for that.
Yeah, I suppose again it's the blood memory, muscle memory, all of these kind of things that we're starting to understand now, that still 3 generations removed from Holocaust survivors, they're seeing PTSD symptoms, etc. So yeah, I think there's evidence to this. We're still very young and not active. Like the world wars were just around the corner. Like they were literally just sort of yesterday. I know a lot of our politicians and our policymakers think that it isn't, but it was.
Well, the people that put, that put the EU down, they forget something. and that is, well, until Russia invaded Ukraine, there had been no war, and there's certainly been no war in Western Europe for 70 years, 80 years. And you think of any time in recorded history when there wasn't war going on all over Europe.
Yeah.
And so the EU has eliminated a lot of that friction.
Mm-hmm.
Borders, if you can cross borders, borders don't really matter that much.
Very true. I mean, the amount of Brits these days, because obviously we can't cross them freely anymore.
Well, that was a big farce and ploy on the British people, and
True.
I think that the country's going to suffer from that until it rejoins.
Yep, 100%. We now have a concept called regret, which is a lovely bit of alliteration, which is to describe the feeling of regret amongst voters that have voted to leave. Again, not to sort of diss anybody's personal politics, but I think it's quite evident that things have gone downhill in the UK since.
Well, the theory was that they were going to build up the Commonwealth, and there was going to be a Commonwealth kind of EU. And then all those countries said, well, what do we need you for? I think that that when you look at the people who promoted it, you don't see them around anymore. Johnson, what was that other fellow? He had that party.
Nigel Farage and UKIP.
Farage, yeah. When they've lost there isn't much respect for them anymore. And I think that, people who first there was that exuberance, we're free, we don't need those rules. Well, you have to follow the rules anyway. It's sort of like those all the countries surrounding the EU, like for instance Switzerland. It has to obey EU rules if it wants its products in the EU. So Britain's going to have the same thing. And I think when it goes back into Europe, it's going to be a much smaller factor, but it's going to have to do that.
I would agree. I would agree. I think the Commonwealth thing, that's what they aimed for, but I don't think they ever really worked too hard for it, and they overplayed their belief in how much of a nice grandmother figure the Queen was, and with her departing, and obviously now the new coronation of King Charles, I think a lot of the remaining countries that haven't already filed paperwork or in some way made a motion towards removing the British monarchy from their system are going to do it. Obviously, there's the American-Japan sort of trade pact that we're trying to get in on, but we either become the 51st state or we rejoin Europe, as you say, on our knees, and we have to earn our seat at the table again, because we didn't just kindly step away. We flipped over the table and shat on the floor. And people need to remember, kind of, it wasn't just this, this gentlemanly thing,
So I was down in Chile, and they have a museum about the revolution and Pinochet and the coup and everything.
Brutal, yeah.
And 7 years into his dictatorship, he took a vote. There was a referendum. Do they want to evolve to a democracy, or do they want him to remain as dictator? 47.5% of the people said they wanted him to remain as a dictator. And I think of Boris Johnson and of Trump in the same way as Pinochet. It's this authoritarian figure, populist authoritarian figure, and can capture a large part of a democratic society. That's very dangerous.
Mm. Enigmatic and articulate individuals have, I think, have always been dangerous throughout human history, and never more so when there is real crisis in the world. And whatever narrative you ascribe to in the world, I think pretty much looking around, you can see that things are not improving. Life expectancy in most Western countries is going down. Well, minus the Scandinavian countries, they've really got their shit together. But yeah, this kind of, they call it this late stage capitalism that we're in, and yeah, it's dire for my generation of kind of the latter millennials. I then look at some of the youth, especially where I live in the north of England, where there's a lot of intergenerational poverty, a lot of socioeconomic inequality, and drugs are the only thing that are keeping their kids fed. It's the only thing getting their rents paid. The, as we spoke of in the preamble, of the little micro economies and communities that are serving each other's needs. And I just, yeah, as we said earlier, I kind of worry where we're going, because I don't think Britain is going to be ready for that conversation about Europe for 10 years at least. I think we're going to have to decimate the Tories and get them out, and then I think certain lords are going to have to be addressed, or at least even the lord situation. You're going to have a conversation on proportional representation. It's little by little. It's like trying to suddenly give a buffet to somebody that's been starved for so long. They need it little by little to be not led as in coerced, but reminded of their power and their authority in this country. The same as any democratic society is the power is in the people, and the people should exert that power on upon the governments and the authoritative systems.
There's going to be a change in perception in Britain in the next couple of years.
In what way?
Well, there has the with the next election in Britain, I think there's going to be a major changeover.
Yeah, I think anyone going to the bookies putting a bet on that the Tories are not going to be the majority government is
Right.
a pretty safe bet. I would say it's then, as we say, kind of what it looks like. I mean, my ideal is a kind of rainbow coalition similar to Germany's traffic light coalition, and that way there's accountability for each individual's ideology. There's much more of a nuanced discussion. It's one of the things, for all I consider the Liberal Democrats, or they're termed as the limp Dems in the UK, because of their impotence while in the coalition. But what they did is force discussions for, whereas Tories behind closed doors could just pass policies over the past 10 years, under the coalition, they had to make that information and plans and plots available to the other parties of the coalition, and information would then ultimately be leaked, and conversations would have to be had publicly. So I think in terms of getting a bit more transparency in British democracy, that's a very good first step. And I think just anything to get rid of a party in the UK that are pulling in now fucking floating barges, prisons on boats. It's like Waterworld, to put in what they're deeming to be unlawful human beings. It's an absurdity. Britain is built on immigration, without going into too much of a rant here, folks. And the legacy of our heritage that we're pissing in the face of right now is fucking disgusting.
The Germans got rid of the Jews during Holocaust, and the Jews were, as a group, were fairly entrepreneurial. So when Merkel allowed in almost 2 million people from Syria, who were basically, those were middle-class people who were made destitute. So it was like an educated group in general. So when they let those in, that was their way of bringing back an entrepreneurial people that will in the next generations, it will spur Germany's industry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
entirely in that.
And that immigrants perform better than the general population in general.
Mm-hmm.
So, and immigrant children of immigrants. So it would be good for Britain to get that. And actually it did spur Britain during when all those East Europeans came over into Britain and set up all kinds of industry, like small businesses and industries all over the island. And of course a lot of them are leaving. So
yeah, that's a sad thing, is that a lot of the infrastructure and the apparatus of society is being built by individuals that are now feeling that they want to leave it. I think we've got a huge exodus of doctors, of nurses. Every other day we've got a strike on from some industry, which entirely, solidarity, because of this situation is fucked in the UK. And it's entirely that. It's injecting individuals into a society. That's maybe too much of a what's the word? A loaded metaphor. But yeah, allowing immigration, it is a net gain. Everywhere we look at the studies, it is a net gain across the board of different culture. Multiculturalism, when not forced, when not what's the word, legislated for, when it's natural and organic, it flourishes in all areas. Like I said, if we think of the Windrush era generation that came over here, and the sound system culture and everything that led to sort of festivals and everything that a lot of the native population now enjoys, came from immigrant cultures that have now integrated into British society. They're as British as anything else. It's frustrating. It's upsetting, because I support Scottish independence. I support Irish reunification, and I support the Welsh as well. So something needs to happen, because if Scotland get free, they're going back to the EU day one. Ireland are already in the EU, so the Northern Irish will become Irish. They're sorted. The Welsh, I guarantee, will follow the Scots. England will be a tiny little island, just London laundering money, just this tiny little corrupt fiefdom.
Well, I think that that London will not be the economics. It's already declining as an economic center as Frankfurt and Rotterdam take hold.
Same as stock markets and monies. I think this is one of the reasons why they changed the Financial Conduct Authority changed its rules on floating basically on the London Stock Exchange for certain companies, as long as they weren't tied by 1 degree to a so-called recreational company, then they can float on the London Stock Exchange. So I think that's the same with psychedelics as well. They're trying to do a similar thing. And I think, again, it's going to miss the point. This country has already spent decades being the world leader in exporter and producer of medicinal cannabis. Yet now the patients in the UK are having to get their products from abroad because we can't seem to connect this infrastructure. Like with this jobs, we need jobs. Everything's collapsing in this country. Like entertainment, pubs are shutting still at like 15, 20 a bloody week or whatever it is, month, sorry. And everything's it's crashing. Whereas if we can get people put back into an industry, a nascent industry now that, in my eyes, could be far more, like I said, than just the drug element of it. We're looking at graphene for supercapacitor batteries. Like I said, what Shell and others are now doing with bio and synthetic ethanols. There's all kinds of things that I think mass production of cannabis can be massively beneficial for this little island, as well as carbon sequestration, as we spoke of. And I think that people want to go back to work. You know what I mean? I think I'm Northern. We've been decimated since Thatcher in the 80s, when she shut the mines and they shipped off all the industry abroad. I know people in the streets around me that are third, fourth generation unemployed. They've just been thrown on the heap. But if you give them weed, they know the math enough to do weed to kilos, tens of kilos. They can eyeball a product from across the room and tell you what it is. They understand the economics of that, but they don't have a degree, so they're seen as useless. This is what I want to say about this liberation. I want communities first to have that opportunity that, yeah, McDonald's and Starbucks, you can open your dispensaries and run all that shit, and you can have these multinational conglomerates, and there will be that. But I also want Dave down the street to still just be able to, if he wants, sell a couple of ounces to just people like his weed. No one else has got anything like it. It's lovely. I'll pay whatever you want, Dave. Here you go. In the same way that if Ethel grew tomatoes or strawberries and she sold a few punnets, I have to see. That's what I'm fighting for at the lowest point. When you asked me earlier, am I for the growers or the consumers? I guess I'm for the growers first, because if most consumers have the opportunity to become a grower, anyone can develop the skill set. It does take time to get real good with it, but now with the technology and with the amount of educational materials like the people like yourself and that have produced, you can go away and learn this shit. There's places in the world you can get degrees in this, like yourself teaches one at Amsterdam. So I want everyone to have that entrepreneurial spirit in them. All of the people that have been touched by cannabis, that like you and I were describing, that you cross paths with it, and it suddenly becomes this symbiotic species, this thing that is going to walk with you for the rest of your life, that it will heal you when you are sick, it will bring you up when you are low, it'll help you socialize, connect. I want to see it more than that. I want to see it rebuild, repair, revolutionize the way we live, you know?
Well, the change is going to come faster than you can believe.
I hope so, Ed, because it feels very lonely in this room some days when I'm just crawling through the internet and all the information and all of the studies and all of the things. And yeah, I think I've been very disheartened by the coronation and all of the monarchy stuff recently.
Yeah,
It's
but he's the very last.
God, I hope so. God, I hope
He
so.
he's the very last.
I mean, I
He's
don't wish
old.
death on him, obviously. That's not what I'm
No,
saying.
he's old to begin with,
Mm,
and I thought of the two Elizabeths. So Elizabeth, the first, that there was this competition. Was it going to be Catholic Spain ruling the New World and the seas, or was it going to be Britain?
mhm,
And so Elizabeth the first, she ruled over an expanding Britain,
mm,
one that stretched its colonies all over the world.
mhm,
And Elizabeth II, she was the other end of the bookend. She
mm,
she she ruled over a Britain um, that that was declining and that was shrinking
mhm,
rather than expanding. And you know, as the royalty traveled around the world recently, and so or the kids, and in country after country, they were told that they weren't wanted.
mhm,
It's the end of it. That whole dream of Commonwealth or ruling the world or having a navy or
mhm.
all of that. It, I think that I think that this is the last king.
I think you may be onto something, obviously, with Harry's kind of exile, and I think William's a lot less popular. But it's a wonderful point of the bookends, actually, because I like going back and focus of the two bookends of the Elizabeths, as you say, is that the British Empire, as I often quote, the Hempire, was built on cannabis. It was one of the resources.
It was built on slavery,
Well, yeah, very
and
true,
and
very
and
true.
it wasn't cannabis. It was sugar cane.
Mm,
It was sugar. It was the first. Sugar was the first addictive drug.
mm,
global addictive drug where there was an industry in it, and it was based on sugar and slavery.
Yeah, there's the establishment of the colonies in Haiti. What I was quipping
All
by,
over,
yeah,
all over.
I've said that was the first one. Yes, what I was quipping about was more the rigs, the sails, the lacquer on the ship, the oil. It was a resource that was taken with them to establish and to cultivate into new spaces. Not so much, yeah, to
But that
gloss
was
over
coming
the history of slavery.
a lot of that was coming from Russia.
The mass imports in with the sort of what would
Yeah.
be modern Latvia and Lithuania and those kind of regions. The sort of mass produced products. Yeah, I'm trying to read back something in my head. There's a quote from the first Queen Elizabeth I of speaking of Russian hemp being the finest sort of textile in the world.
They had very cheap labor and vast planes that could support it.
Well, that was obviously, we ended up with a lot of it's interesting when you look at the Soviet era investigations into cannabis, because obviously they went further than Carl Linnaeus's 3 distinctions of the subgenus, and they were looking at around 13. And so the variant like bridge types that they were looking at from the different regions, would have meant that cannabis that was coming from that would have been different to anything else in the lower European areas, because it didn't have those day neutral genes that we were speaking of. So they were more susceptible to changes in the climate. So there was less sort of consistency within that relationship. And yeah, I think when we ultimately fell out, I think that was the beginnings of issues in Europe, really, before the formation of Germany in the First World War, and obviously Russia and the whole evolution through. So yeah, it's I just again want to see cannabis as that resource that, instead of building and enforcing slavery and these terrible economic structures upon people around the world, to liberate them from it.
Well, I don't think that cannabis played a part in that traditionally. Just look at the first bookend, and then you'll see the other bookend. You'll see the mirror of it.
I suppose actually, you're kind of right in terms of then what is happening in those other regions that I've just sort of spoke of. There is just these ebbs of flow of time and history, and it's always difficult to ever try and feel like you can move a cog to participate within this vast system of history. It's an interesting thought of it, like the bookends. I like that analogy. I very much like that analogy. Obviously, we've ended up speaking quite about all sorts of European history and whatnot here. I'm just going to quickly have a look at my notes, because there's definitely a few questions that I really wanted to get into the podcast. Obviously, you and Ben Dronkus, you founded the first hash hemp and marijuana museum in Amsterdam.
Well, I was the first curator, and then Ben took it over soon after. Soon after I did my work there.
Nice. And there's obviously a second site in Barcelona. So my question was, is there scope to open sort of one in America? Is there any kind of museums or an education center like that? Obviously, you've got Amsterdam as the university, as we kind of briefly mentioned earlier. But are there any plans or US museums or any of the
I think that Don Worcester has a museum in Ohio, but I don't know of any big museum. I don't know of any actual formal museums. in the U.S. right now.
Okay. Is it the Smithsonian? Is that one of the big they do natural science as a museum?
Yes.
Is there anything cannabis in there, or is that still because it's federally prohibited? It's not really.
I don't know if it's covered in there, but uh, there's certainly more information about it, and there are certainly exhibitions at museums regarding cannabis.
Okay.
There was our museum, the Oakland Museum of California, just had an exhibit of.
Nice. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's one of those things, like I mentioned before, about
Yeah.
losing the kind of information and education throughout the years. Obviously, I think that's what motivates people like yourself to write so prolifically, is to kind of spread this awareness. I mean, it's one of the reasons I want to do this podcast, is to capture the stories of the people who've been there or who are here. And as you said, in 30 years, it's going to be a very different world. And I want to be able to appreciate and kind of literally look back on the evolution of this, because so much has changed in even just the 10 years that I've been sort of active publicly in this space. And I think, yeah, you're right, so much more is going to change.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, actually, because obviously you mentioned you're from the Bronx. What's your thoughts on New York right now, with its kind of war with Eric Adams, the mayor, against the 1,500 odd kind of unlawful, unlicensed dispensaries, and that handful, I think it is at this point, of licensed ones?
I think prohibition will be as effective as it ever was.
That is a perfect answer. That, yeah. Solution? Do you think there's, because this is what I see everywhere, is legalization, air quotes, and legalization seems to work for a handful of investors for the first 6 months. And then the whole system, the tax gets paid, and some goes into the county shares and whatever else into the state coffers and can be useful. But in terms of what happens to the legacy individuals, the long-term investors, etc., there seems to be a lot of people getting screwed. And like you said, a lot of people are just happy to exist under the radar.
So let me ask you a question. You know any songs about how great it is to be a farmer?
Oh, I'm thinking
I
that.
mean, there are all kinds of laments. I mean, you could probably think of a few laments about farming, but you can't think of any. Maybe that kid song, "Old MacDonald Had a Farm," but that's the only one that I can think of. And so so with when marijuana was illegal, there was a premium paid for risk, and there was a problem with supply. Now there isn't a problem with supply, and farmers aren't taking a risk. So the economics of farming comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, there aren't any songs about how great it is to be a farmer.
Yeah. I mean,
Wait, hold on. We have to hold on for just a minute. I have to get some dough. I'm sorry. I've been
no
going for
worries.
too long without it. Hold on for a moment.
Doctor's advice, go get it sorted.
I'm back.
Hey, welcome back.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
can't...
walked all the way down to the corner, saw my local dealer, and picked up a bud. Pretty quick, huh?
Nice. It's like we're living in the future.
Yeah.
What did I want to look at here as well? So yeah, you obviously alluded to it in your answer with New York, of prohibition is, going to work as well as prohibition does. So it currently seems that these legalization models are enforced by criminalizing the fringes. But it's not coercing people into the legal space. So
No, well, look, what the way I look at it is that if you're an occasional user, then like you're going to buy an eighth of an ounce and go to a party or something. You're going to buy a quarter ounce and you're going to savor it for a month or a month and a half. Those people, there's no reason for them to go to a dealer, although they might. But the chronic users who, when they hold up an eighth and they've paid $50 for the eighth or $35 for that little eighth, and they look at it and they say, this is a day's worth. And those people have an incentive. What I call the chronic users have the incentive to go and find a different source of cannabis that's considerably cheaper. So, and whether you're talking about flower or concentrates, it's the same. And so everything that's available on these in the legal market is available through different dealers.
Yeah, I suppose the diversification is quite interesting, and it's created a unique synergy and kind of intersection between cannabis and now natural psychedelics, things like mescaline and
mushrooms,
sort of psilocybin, etc.
Mushrooms are really big, and they're not meeting the resistance to legalization that cannabis did. So they're becoming legal really quickly, and lots of people are microdosing.
I think I like the way they've gone about decriminalization included in these things. So personal possession, small cultivation at home, I think is vitally important. Especially when I think Oregon's first services just being licensed, and their services are like $2,300. So it's one of the things that I worry about, that I've probably alluded to several times in this recording, is that classist impediment and barrier, that they become this wonder drug for a certain group of people in society, but for actually the people that probably need them the most, they remain inaccessible.
So here's how, I don't think so. So, you go to the store, you buy some pre-cooked rice that comes in a bag, and you heat it up and you let it cool down so that you make sure that it is sterile. And then you take the hypodermic that has the spores in it, or better yet, the germinated spores, liquid. You inject it into there, and 2 weeks later you harvest mushrooms. Where's the class impediment?
It's more education and access barrier. I get what you're saying, because actually in most regions as well.
That's why the world will need the new book that we're publishing, that will be out in about 6 months, 8 months, on how the easiest ways to grow mushrooms.
Excellent.
It takes much less effort or time than growing pot.
Considerably, it would seem. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So you have to erase that classist thing from your mind as far as mushrooms are concerned.
Well, under prohibition, I would still say that it's very much the case, because in this country at the minute, you can pay $6,000 for a weekend infusion of ketamine. But if you get caught with it on the street, then you could face some serious consequences.
Yeah, but here's what: we're not talking about ketamine; we're talking about mushrooms.
It's still the same. It's a class A in this country.
Yeah, but don't put the mushroom pack in your window.
I agree. I get what you're saying. It's
So go over to Holland. You pick up some spores and you come back.
I mean, in this country, they are strictly sold for research purposes. There are several companies. Shout out Micro Revolution, that's and Aztec
Yeah.
as well.
Okay.
They've done some
So
wonderful
it's not really
research
it
spores.
it really isn't a class thing
Mm.
as far as mushrooms are concerned.
I
Anybody
suppose
can
then
do it.
it's
It's not expensive.
the lack of education, I suppose. Yeah, as we said.
That, and as I said, we have a new book coming out. It's uh, Welcome to Psilocybin is the name of it. It will be out in 8 months, and it shows you how to do it. And 2 weeks later, 2 weeks after you start the project, you're harvesting.
I would very much love to read that book when it's out, for research purposes, strictly, of course. YouTube guidance, people. Um, yeah, so it's a wonderful thing that wherever there is some form of loosening, if not a cessation fully of prohibition, but some form of loosening of the enforcement of laws and limited access lawfully to cannabis, seems to lead to these far more socially progressive changes. Obviously in different regions now that are decriminalizing. I mean, we've seen what's happening up in Canada. Jerry Martin, an activist up there, has just recently been arrested for openly selling methamphetamine, MDMA, heroin, cocaine, all tested products, because obviously Vancouver's decriminalized the possession of these drugs. So there is these kind of movements towards testing these other models, and I think ultimately, again, as you alluded to before about prohibition, that we have to start having these wider conversations, because there's obviously a lot of scare stories at the minute of fentanyl laced cannabis, and it just feels like there's so much misinformation and there's so much crap that's going on, and propaganda between different sides, warring factions, as it were. That people that want to keep it illegal for certain reasons, people that want it legalized for other reasons.
Well, you know what? So I want to separate psilocybin and cannabis from all those other drugs that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
All those other drugs are debilitating. Every one of them. There's not one of them that you mentioned that is good for humanity. And in putting cannabis and psilocybin and other psychedelics in the same class as those very debilitating drugs, it denigrates cannabis. And there is a separation. There is a definite separation. Cannabis helps humanity. Those other drugs, we know how debilitating they are. If you want to see how debilitating they are, you just come to San Francisco and see all the addicts, homeless addicts on the streets.
I agree that there are people and percentages in all populations that struggle with them, but there are millions of people in South America that rely on the coca leaf to deal with altitude sickness. There are hundreds of millions of people that are prescribed methamphetamine as Ritalin and Adderall.
No, excuse me, that may be, but those prescriptions from Ritalin aren't helping. And I feel for the people who are producing poison, but it's poison. And I have little empathy for stopping that industry. I'm not saying that the way that we're trying to end it, which has been totally unsuccessful. I'm not saying that that's a proper way, but don't define cannabis with debilitating drugs, the other debilitating drugs that you're talking about that are poisonous. And I have yet to see a fentanyl user, a heroin user who's getting any benefit from it. You can see them on the streets right here in San Francisco Bay Area.
I agree.
So you have to, in your own mind, I know that you haven't, but you have to separate cannabis from those other drugs. It's a whole different story, because cannabis, for the most part, is useful, as you know, and as you advocate, is totally useful to humans.
Mm-hmm.
in many different levels. I wouldn't put cocaine, I would not put heroin or fentanyl in that same class.
So I agree. I'm not.
But you were.
Well,
You
no,
were. No,
it was
you were.
it was in the same sentence. I will
You
entirely
were
agree with that.
defining them in the same way. Oh, he's selling all these things. No, somebody, like there was a 60s song and it said a dealer sells you sweet dreams and has other things to say about powders. So that it was a problem of prohibition, that prohibitionists had no way of defining delineating between debilitating drugs and cannabis. They put them all in the same class. Of course, they said cannabis was introduced you to the drug culture, and then
the gateway,
and as it turns out that in New York State, if you have a prescription, when marijuana was only legal medically in New York State, if you had a prescription for an opiate, you could use it to get cannabis. So heroin was a gateway drug to cannabis.
Yeah.
In that case. So
and this is what we're seeing with pink clinics. Basically, what I was sort of saying before is obviously I want the promotion of natural psychedelics for just people's personal, spiritual, recreational consumption, whatever they choose to build that relationship with those compounds. Obviously, the medicinalization, pharmaceuticalized versions of, like I said, cocaine is imported into this country and used medicinally in eye surgeries. There's some very dodgy paperwork that goes on as to where the several dozens of kilos of cocaine goes when it comes into the UK. Like we said, of opioids, for all I agree that what we're seeing spilled out into the streets and the unregulated spaces in problematic populations of people that are suffering with mental health conditions, that are in socioeconomically deprived situations, that are victims.
Excuse me. Don't define heroin in that way. It's hitting all sectors of society. Read the obituary pages, and you hear of all these people who in your papers who die of unexplained causes in their 40s. They're all dead from fentanyl or heroin, mostly fentanyl. You see it all the time in the newspapers, like prominent people died of undisclosed causes, 43. Boom.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes down again, adulteration.
See it in singers and comics a lot.
Yeah, and that from poly drug use, and often, let's say, tainted supplies. Like Mac Miller, one of my favorite musicians, there was fentanyl in some of the benzo, whatever it was that he was getting, and that fucked him up and killed him. And this, all I was saying, or was sort of trying to move the conversation onto in that way, was speaking of regulation, testing. That again, as you said, prohibition is going to be prohibition. These compounds exist, and actually we're seeing that the restrictive, what the Americans have pushed with China for fentanyl, has pushed it even further underground, so even that's getting more tainted. It's started now to push production of car fentanyl, which is 100 times fucking stronger than that, which the only reason they've got that classified is to, air quote, tranquilize elephants. It's
here's the thing. I don't know. What you've said is that the solution that they're trying isn't working. And I don't know enough about how, I don't have a solution how to regulate it or how to control it. And neither do you. And so far, neither does do any of the governments.
I think Dana Larson's probably the closest to just testing.
Well, testing what? Somebody picks up, like, I could see where you would say, okay, so if you have heroin tested, then will know it doesn't have fentanyl in it. Yeah, but ultimately, even if it doesn't have fentanyl in it, heroin by itself is totally debilitating. And people who say, oh, I've got it under control, I'm going to work, I'm functional, and I'm still using it, I only use it on weekends, look at them 10 years later and see where they are.
Okay. Again, not to be sort of contentious.
But
I'm enjoying this conversation. I'm not taking obviously there's any
no.
sort of
But I
malice
mean,
in this.
but I'll tell you what. Either they've cleaned up, or they're dead or on their way to death. And it's all often from like secondary causes like pneumonia, and that's from exposure from being outside, things like that. But basically, in the U.S. there's a term for it. I don't know if you're using it in Britain. Deaths of despair. So there might be a primary reason: died of pneumonia, died of flu, died of something like that. But really, it's died from alcohol overdose, died from drug overdose. But really, the deaths of despair, and it has brought down. It's so prevalent that it's brought down the death ages of death, like life expectancy.
Life expectancy, yeah.
And because all these men, mostly men, 30 to 50 years old in the United States, are dying of these deaths of despair. And I bet you have something similar to that in Britain.
We have, yeah, good few thousand. Scotland is leading the way in this, but it's still.
So I'm not saying. I mean, the solutions. On the one hand, we were talking about. You were talking about using police and criminal methods of dealing with it hasn't worked, and I think that that it's sociological. It's based on what used to be called under Thatcher redundancy. And that's been going on in Britain now for like a whole generation, so that there are generations of kids who haven't really have what would be considered the normal thing of growing up, getting education, going to work, so on. They haven't had that experience in their families for generations, based on the fact basically that there is no opportunity, and the disinvestment of the rich in Britain, that is the only investment that the rich Brits have, is in the city of London, and they're out of Britain, and they've shut Britain down, and they're shutting Britain down, and they don't really care. And let's go back to Dickinson. I mean,
Victorian era.
What?
Victorian era, like the
but Oliver Twist.
Yeah.
Modern version.
Yeah.
So
again, and this is where I think that the drugs then become. There's a really interesting study by a Canadian psychologist, Bruce K. Alexander, called Rat Park, and he was testing the drug addiction hypothesis back in the 1970s, I think it was, 80s, 70s. It was a while ago. And basically what they found is if you put a rat in a cage and with a bottle with water and a bottle of water with cocaine, the rats will kill themselves drinking the water with cocaine. But if you put that same rat in an environment where it's got sensory stimulation, it's got sexual partners, friends, food, places to explore, and provide the water, the two waters, most of the rats will try the drug, but then the majority of them will not go back to it at all, other than at moments of distress. So there's other studies as well that have noted in populations that once you've had an exposure to a drug, you're much more likely to then use that as a potential crutch. So this is where we see alcohol become problematic in people's lives around funerals, bereavement, loss of job, breakup of relationship, etc. They go to the thing that gives them a numbing, a comfort, a release, an escapism. And
alcohol is an interesting drug in that there seems to be a genetic component to it as well.
yeah, I think that's something the Brits, we notice amongst our aristocracy of what they call prenatal alcohol syndrome. And it changes the physical formations of people's faces. And as you say, it's the epigenetics. It's turning something on in that system, as we spoke of before about intergenerational trauma. And there is early evidence to suggest that the same is true with other drugs. So there's studies that obviously suggest that children of smokers were up to a period, obviously with law change and stuff in the UK, it's kind of modified the data. But previously it was that if you were a child of a smoker, you were much more likely to develop the habit, whether that was exposure, normalization, lack of the parent then shouting at you, etc.
So it's a combination. It's epigenetics and it's culture as well. So
yeah,
you see your parents smoking all the time, figure that's normal for adults.
exactly. And then if you see somebody that you admire that's cool, if it's then a trait you want to mirror and emulate. And again, this is where I'm an advocate for responsible drug use. There is a doctor called Dr. Carl Hart. He is an open heroin user, and obviously the heroin that he gets is dihydromorphine. It's pure heroin, which is, as we were saying before, I agree. It's so set and setting, to borrow a phrase from McKenna and others, with these things. Because if you're a grandmother that falls down the stairs and breaks a hip really badly, you'll go into hospital and have a diamorphine heroin hooked up in your veins. You could have it for weeks at a time, depending if they had to reconstruct it. You'd then be sent home with Oromorph, another oral take morphine. And you wouldn't develop the same sort of problematic relationship, or statistically speaking, you're a lot less likely to. Whereas if you're then at a point of desperation
I had a friend who had really bad like hip and spine problems. And before he got operated on, I mean, he was for a while he was like only semi-conscious, I would say, not fully there because he was taking so many opiates. I'm talking about prescription. And he had his operation and the pain ceased, and he just stopped taking all the opiates. I mean, he was what you would call heavily addicted. I mean, he was, if it was an addiction thing, but as soon as the pain stopped, he stopped taking them. No, he felt bad for a couple of days, but it wasn't a problem for him.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's meeting that need. And so this is what I say about the more obviously we can champion cannabis and psychedelics to help people identify trauma, deal with pain, social anxiety, the trauma of just being human in this reality. You know what I mean? It'll lessen people's want for these other substances. So we've got a major problem, for example, in UK prisons, with synthetic cannabinoids, spice, which literally has killed a couple of hundred people from what I'm looking at, or nearly a couple of hundred people from the research, the preliminary research.
I think the best thing you could do for people in prison is give them gummies.
Give them gummies, like kind of edible gummies, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is I went to visit.
No fire. Like even with vapes, people might be able to, do something nefarious with them, but with gummies,
you just eat it. Yeah,
I said to my friend, I get high on a plane on planes all the time, and he said, no. He said, do you do it in the bathroom? I said, no, I do it at my seat. He's saying, you don't. And I pulled out a little the gummy, just show him the gummy. I said, you know what? They don't stop you from taking these.
Yeah, I mean, why would they? It's just, I imagine the cabin crew would rather everyone was very chilled out and mellow rather than sitting good. Another drink, another drink, another drink. Like, all right, two more. Come on, more drinks, please, love. Come on.
They do really limit in the U.S. now. They really do limit the number of drinks that people can have because they've had so many incidents. I mean, people have been attacking the attendants. It's really, why are you doing that?
It's again a lack of education. There's something within the altitude that you get drunker quicker. It's such a fast intoxicant.
I think that is this stress that Americans have that I haven't felt as much in Europe, but Americans are under total stress all the time. Well, all those random mass shootings, I mean, you hear about it every day.
Yeah.
And they allow these military style weapons. I'm 18. I don't have a record. Give me that gun. Oh yeah, give me 1,000 rounds of ammunition. I'm going hunt. What are you doing? Oh, I'm going deer hunting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the things I admire about America, but I also find difficult to kind of deal with because I don't like being ruled by history. Is the Constitution that it allows and protects freedom of speech and protection from unfair search and seizure and etc.
Yeah, well, you have the Second Amendment, and it says, in order to have a well-regulated militia, people will be allowed to have arms. But I don't think an 18-year-old with an AK-47 is a well-regulated militia. See, so like they forgot that other part of it, and the conservatives on the Supreme Court ruled that was an individual right, not the right within a militia status. But
yeah, so it just gave that expressed right to all individuals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't you feel safe? You're in a bar in Texas and people can actually have an open carry weapon. They have a weapon that you see the weapon. Like a cop, you see the weapon. Well, not in Britain too much, but you see like in American things, and the weapon is hanging out of the police uniform, and everything. You can just go into a bar in Texas with a weapon like that. Feel good drinking with that person? Get into a political argument.
Yeah, good point. Yeah,
have another drink.
It's one of those kind of quintessentially American dilemmas that obviously I find it difficult to comment on as a Brit, a former colonizer and all of that. But yeah, it's the way I would see that America is able to handle that problem is first there was a global de-escalation, like Britain, like we're the world's second largest arms dealer. We're talking about like not much less of an industry, but fuck me, we produce some weapons and trade some armaments around the world. I think if we can de-escalate that kind of, it's all resource wars effectively anyway. And this sort of brings me back to the cannabis thing. I mean, we're now looking at like mycelium for packaging to replace like polystyrene in grow packaging. I said bamboos and other grasses in the same vein that they've kind of done the same fabric material research into cannabis and others. So I think that if we can reduce that stress that you speak of this feeling of this rat race. We can take us out of that cage with the bottle of cocaine and water and put us back in Rat Park. I think human society will function a lot better. But whenever we feel that it's this tribalism of we're running out of fire and they've still got fire, we should go take their fire. That mentality is really fucking up the world right now.
Well, that's that mentality that I said that it was one of the ways of war is one of the ways of getting rid of excess men and capturing women.
Yeah.
So,
So
look how well it's doing. For instance, look how well it's doing in the Ukraine. So, first of all, I would say Russia has lost more men to people going into exile than it has on the battlefield, and it's lost more than 100,000 on the battlefield, probably considerably more. And Ukraine has suffered, all kinds of, terrible, horrendous things but its men are being expended as well. So there's a perfect thing. So there'll be all these women left there'll be more women around for Russia. Well, you would have thought for Russian men, but now there's just going to be an excess of women there. So interesting to see what happens from it.
yeah,
we've seen what happens when there's an excess of men. I'll give you an example: China. And you can see how the cultural practices in China are changing, where professional women aren't getting married. The birth rate is extremely low.
Yeah. Japan as well, in terms of what's happening out there with their sex collapse, as they describe it.
Japan, Korea. Yeah.
It's interesting because it's all of the spaces, when you look at, again, not too recent history of the past century, the consequences of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all of the conflict with China.
Oh, yeah, but same thing in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
You can't blame wars there. So, but in Scandinavia, the birth rate is lower than. Well, look.
I mean, it is cold.
well, you think you want to snuggle, but
yeah, that's a good point. Good point.
But women have the reality of what it takes to be a mother has sunk in, and not all women want to do that. And if they do it, they don't want. Most women don't want a lot of kids. Maybe two, maybe one.
Yeah,
But just think how good it would be for the world. So much of the work that people do is going to be done by robots and machinery, or one way or another, whether it's cleaning your room with an automatic vacuum, or whether driving long distances, all these things. So if women had just one child per woman, the way they did in China, you'd have a shrinking workforce, but you had a shrinking need for a workforce. So the population of the earth could go down by billions of people in several generations. and that would be certainly less taxing to the world, to Earth, to planet Earth, than having the number of people that we have now. So just think how much more spread out people would be if there were only 2 billion people.
And for, as you say, for it to occur organically and not through genocide or warfare,
Right.
I think then, and I think that's it. It's kind of going to happen because of cultural trends and everything else.
It has happened in China. There
Mhm.
were actually more deaths than births last year.
With
It took a couple of years.
there's
And as you know, Japan, Korea,
But they've got massive problems with the technology isn't quite there to deal with the aging population. So I was actually learning recently that quite a lot of Japan's homeless are elderly, which is ever more tragic when you consider the honoring of elders in Japanese heritage and culture. I can't remember what the other thing I was going to say was.
elder, it's not elderly. It's like, are they elderly that need assisted living?
No, they're typically capable. Yeah, once you become incapable, incapable, I think that they're still, but it's the same with the care system in the UK. Is that there's not really the incentive to take care of it. I mean, there is a Swedish mathematician. I remember reading about a few years ago, and he did the calculation of a peak child. I think his project was called Peak Child, and he just studied basically all of the data that he could for like a century previous, and did the calculations. And they were talking about topping 10 to 11 billion on the planet by the year 2100, just because of the people that are already here. And then if they only have, as you say, one child as a replacement, healthcare is going to grow to a point where, or theoretically, healthcare was growing to a degree where the average person could expect their life expectancy to keep growing the older they got, so they would live ever longer with each generation.
So that's not true. The population, for instance, in China, where women are, it depends how many children women have, but you can already see that in China, the population is declining.
I said that the people that the younger ones that then grow up as they replace. Obviously, this guy's project was based on prior to COVID and the economic crash.
It's been going. This trend has been going on for quite a few years, and it's that women have fewer. They have fewer children, and they have children later. And so that if you just say, well, we're going to keep everything the same way it is now and the same culture, then it might top off at 11 billion. But he's not taking into account that there can be a quick change in culture.
Well, yeah, like I said, that was based on his historic data and trends, and that was
right. For instance, let's say India supplied Social Security. I'm not saying that it's going to do it with this administration, but let's say it instituted Social Security. Well, if it did that, there'd be an immediate incentive to have fewer children.
Also,
see? Because one of the reasons why you want to have a bunch of children is so they can support you in old age. But if the state took over that, then there'd be more incentive. There might be an incentive not to have as many children. There would be an incentive.
No, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Man, we've touched on so many topics here.
Yeah. Okay.
Should we wrap up? Because
we have to wrap up. Yeah. I have another appointment. Okay.
Yeah, no worries. No worries.
So you can arrange another. We could get together again. Just arrange it with Jane.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to.
Okay.
There's quite a lot to discuss here, but yeah, thank you very much for your time, Ed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I know that we went far away from cannabis, actually.
I love it. I love it. It was awesome.
So can I ask you, is your program live, or are we live now?
No, we're not live now. It's pre-recorded. This will go out on Monday. I'll drop you a link via email
Okay.
with a copy of the video.
Are you going to do the entire program, or do you edit it?
I'll edit out where we stopped sort of in the middle for you to get some more smoke and that kind of moment with Jane there.
Yeah,
I'll compress it a little.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Just take out all those curse words I used,
I
and
am very pro swearing.
all the people I defamed, and and of course
all those outrageous conspiracies you were chatting there.
My rants and raves against different ethnic and racial groups. So please remove all those, so people still think that I'm a nice guy.
I shall indeed, brother. I shall indeed. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I look forward to having another conversation again. Have a wonderful day, brother.
Okay, bye.
Well, there you go, folks. That was the wonderful Ed Rosenthal. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I really appreciate Ed's sense of humor, his breadth of knowledge and awareness, of sort of the history and the intersectionality of all of these things. And yeah, man, that was thoroughly engaging. We didn't get through half of the stuff that I intended to talk about, so I'm really glad that he offered and suggested there that we have another recording, because I think there's quite a lot still to cover there. There's so much we didn't talk about. Sort of 2002 arrest and sort of the legal issues and everything that went on there after he was deputized by the local sheriff. Whole story, which is an amazing thing that I really want to talk to him about. Really glad that he sort of agreed on a few points and kept sort of. He understood that legalization isn't the end of prohibition. For all I didn't quite get to ask the questions directly that I wanted to about that, to hear someone of his caliber and of his longevity in the space to have that awareness and understanding is comforting to me personally, and I hope to yourselves to kind of as well, and bringing that kind of awareness to the whole situation and what is going down. You know what I mean? I don't know if I'll ever be lucky enough to be Ed's age. I don't know if I'll be lucky enough to be Ed's age and have lived through whatever comes sort of next, and if we actually get any more, like what happens as progress continues or where it goes, what direction it is. It's wonderful to hear he's so kind of optimistic for the future. As I said, the kind of the break I've taken recently is I felt too pessimistic. I've felt a little bit nervous about the way that I would handle myself on the podcast, not because I'm kind of worried that I would sort of embarrass myself or do anything or say anything stupid. But I just didn't want to be negative. I didn't want to be so depressed, and I just bring the conversation down. So yeah, taking a break. We're back in the saddle. Ed Rosenthal, thoroughly fucking enjoyed that. We're back next week with it's I think Dr. Gary Potter. That's Gary Potter, not Harry Potter. Criminologist. So that's going to be very fun. And then I'm not going to tell you who's 115 and 116. They're special. They're special individuals. And they're going to be special episodes, and you're going to enjoy it. And it's going to be wonderful. So yeah, if you enjoyed this, I don't know how long I've been sat here, a couple of hours now, 2 hours, maybe long podcast. Then yeah, please do give us a like, share, and a subscribe. Please do actually hit that subscribe. You know, I know quite a large percentage of you fine viewers and listeners are not subscribed on YouTube. Do try and help you get there. Same with actually giving ratings on any given platform or anything. It does personally encourage me to keep this content going at moments of, I wouldn't quite call it despair, but let's just call it moments of less motivation in this sphere. But I want to be here. I want to remain here. I want to keep bringing these conversations to you guys. There's a lot of wonderful people that I am in communication with that I want to have these conversations with and bring them to your wonderful ears and eyes. With a better, I need to figure out this camera, because look, I know it's an ugly mug, but look, that's a good quality camera. That is a good quality camera when it isn't doing this fucking light thing. So I need to figure this out. I do apologize to any epileptics watching. Yeah, check us out on patreon.com/Simpa Life, where you can help fund to keep the lights on and potentially buy another fucking camera. technology, or if anybody knows how to stop this Zoom thing on this, then yeah, hit me up below, because it would be greatly appreciated. It's driving me slowly mental, and I don't need more things to drive me mental right now. I'm ranting and raving. Yeah, check it out on all social media platforms at Simpa Life. Yeah, you know what to do. Peace and love, folks. I'll see you next week.